If Ned Stark had refused Robert Baratheon's offer to become Hand of the King, the entire course of Game of Thrones would have changed dramatically. The letter had arrived in the dead of night, sealed with the royal sigil of House Baratheon. Its words carried the weight of an entire kingdom, yet when Eddard Stark read them, his heart grew heavier with something else: dread. Robert Baratheon, his oldest friend and the King of Westeros, was coming to Winterfell. The journey alone was an extravagance, a king travelling so far north. But the reason for the visit was clear. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, was dead, and Robert needed a new hand. Catelyn stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. "You know what this means," she said softly. Ned set the letter aside, rubbing his brow. "Aye," he said, "and I don't like it. Will you accept?" she asked. There was worry in her eyes. The last time he had ridden south, it had cost him his father and brother. The South was a snake pit full of liars, schemers, and betrayers. "I don't know," he admitted. A few days later, Robert arrived with his queen, Cersei Lannister, and their retinue. He was the same Robert Ned remembered, loud, boisterous, still clinging to the glory of the past. The years had changed him, and though his belly was rounder, his beard speckled with grey, and his eyes dulled by drink, after feasts and pleasantries, the moment finally came. In the quiet of the crypts beneath Winterfell, Robert stood before Lyanna's tomb and said, "I need you, Ned. You must be my hand." Ned looked at his friend. "I am honoured, Your Grace, but I must refuse." Robert turned to him sharply, laughter dying in his throat. "What did you say?" "You have no shortage of lords eager for power," Ned said carefully. "But my place is in the north. Winter is coming, and my people need me here." Robert scowled. "Damn it, Ned, I need you, not some southern vulture." "I am no politician," Ned replied. "You know that. I would not last a year in King's Landing." Robert stared at him for a long time, then let out a long sigh. "You stubborn Northman," he muttered. "You always were too good for politics." "I am sorry, Robert," Ned said. Robert clapped a hand on his shoulder. "No, you're not, but I'll respect your decision." And just like that, fate was rewritten. The morning after Robert Baratheon and his royal party departed from Winterfell, a strange sense of relief settled over the castle. Eddard Stark had expected to feel guilt, perhaps even regret, for refusing his king's request. Instead, he felt something else entirely: certainty. The South had taken too much from House Stark already. He had no desire to send himself into the same den of vipers that had devoured his father and brother. His place was here, in the north, where duty was clear and honor meant something. Still, Catelyn watched him with worry. "Do you think Robert will be safe?" she asked. Ned frowned. "He's surrounded by Lannisters. That is never safe." What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his refusal had already set events in motion in King's Landing. Robert Baratheon rode through the gates of the Red Keep, his face dark with frustration. Cersei, standing on the balcony, studied him with sharp, knowing eyes. She had suspected Ned Stark would refuse, and now, with Robert's most trusted friend absent, their grip on the throne tightened. The small council gathered that evening, their murmurs filling the chamber. "We must name a new hand," Grandmaster Pycelle droned. "The realm cannot govern itself. Let it be one of our own," Tywin Lannister's letter had read earlier. "It is time House Lannister secures its place beside the throne." Robert, still, nursing his wounded pride, waved his goblet. "Fine, who?" Littlefinger, ever the opportunist, leaned forward with a smirk. "Lord Tywin himself would be a wise choice, Your Grace, or perhaps Sir Jaime." Cersei smiled, pleased. "My father would rule." "Wisely. He commands the wealth and power of the Westerlands," Robert scoffed. "Tywin, aye, he's rich, But I fought a war to put this crown on my head, and I'll not have Tywin ruling in my place." He took another swig of wine. "I'll name Stannis." Silence fell. Even Littlefinger seemed momentarily thrown. Stannis? The humorless, rigid brother, who followed rules like a septon. The man who openly despised the Lannisters. Cersei's expression tightened. "Stannis is an excellent commander," Pycelle said cautiously, "but the people do not love him." "And what does that matter?" Robert snapped. "He will keep the realm in order." Cersei leaned forward. "You cannot be serious, Robert. Stannis will tear apart everything we have built." "What you have built?" Robert's eyes burned into her. Tension thickened the air. The Lannisters had thought they would place a puppet as hand. Instead, they had gained their greatest enemy within the capital. Word reached Stannis Baratheon quickly. His face remained unreadable as he read the Raven's message. His fingers tightened around the parchment. Stannis Baratheon wasted no time. Within days of receiving Robert's summons, he arrived in King's Landing, his face as hard as the stones of Dragonstone. Unlike Ned Stark, Stannis had no illusions about the South. He did not trust the small council, nor did he trust the Lannisters. But he would serve because duty demanded it. When he stepped into the small council chamber for the first time as Hand of the King, the tension was thick enough to choke a man. Cersei sat beside Robert, her fingers tapping against the arm of her chair in irritation. Petter Baelish, Varys, and Pycelle exchanged wary glances. None of them wanted Stannis in this position. Unlike Ned Stark, he was not honorable to a fault. He was ruthless in his justice. He would see corruption, and he would burn it out without hesitation. Robert, already drunk despite the early hour, grinned. "Brother, finally, someone in this room I can trust." Stannis sat stiffly. "You have surrounded yourself with flatterers and schemers, Your Grace. That is your own doing." A lesser man would have been thrown from the chamber for such words, but Robert only laughed. Cersei, however, did not. Her eyes gleamed with something dangerous. Cersei Lannister knew she had to act quickly. Stannis was no fool. If given time, he would uncover the truth about her children. He would see Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella for what they truly were, not Baratheons at all. That night, she met with her brother Jaime in her chambers. "We must move against him," she said. Jaime's golden hand clenched into a fist. "How?" "He is not like Stark. He cannot be tricked into treason." "He does not need to be," Cersei whispered. "He only needs to die." But Stannis was already a step ahead. Stannis wasted no time playing the game of whispers. Within his first week as Hand, he began investigating Jon Arryn's death. He retraced the dead man's steps, spoke with the same people Jon had spoken to before his death. His brother had given him authority, and Stannis used it ruthlessly. He soon found what Jon Arryn had found before him, the truth. The royal children were not Baratheons. They were Lannisters. Stannis knew what had to be done. He prepared his case, gathering his closest allies. Sir Davos was at his side. Letters were being sent to the great lords of the realm. The time for subtlety was over, but before he could act, disaster struck. A week later, Robert Baratheon rode out on his infamous hunt, but this time something was different. He was not just hunting a boar, he was being hunted himself. The wine was poisoned. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to dull his reflexes, slow his movements. When the boar charged, he barely reacted. The beast's tusks tore into him, and he collapsed onto the forest floor, blood spilling from his body. By the time his men carried him back to the Red Keep, it was already too late. King Robert Baratheon was dying, and Cersei Lannister was smiling. King Robert Baratheon lay dying in his chambers, his skin pale, his breath ragged. The scent of blood, wine, and death filled the room as his men surrounded him in silent grief. Stannis Baratheon stood by his bedside, his jaw clenched tight. He had spent years warning Robert that his lifestyle would kill him, but not like this, not by some damn bore. Something was wrong. Cersei, draped in her mourning gown, stood at the far side of the room, her face a mask of sorrow, but her eyes gleamed with victory. "Leave us," Robert wheezed. His voice was weak, but still a command. The room emptied except for Stannis, Cersei, and the dying king. Robert reached for his brother's hand. "You are my hand. You are my brother, and you are the only one I trust." His breath was shallow, and Stannis had to lean in to hear him. "Protect my children." Stannis stiffened. He already knew the truth, that Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella were not Baratheons at all. Cersei's grip on her gown tightened. "You need rest, my love. Don't waste your breath." Robert turned his head toward her, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "Was it you?" Cersei's lips parted, but no words came. She quickly recovered. "What are you saying, Robert?" "Your mind is clouded by pain." Robert's fingers clenched around Stannis's wrist. "Do not let them take my throne." His voice was hoarse. "Do what you must." With those final words, the usurper king exhaled his last breath. Silence hung over the room. Then Cersei turned to Stannis with a thin smile. "You should kneel, Lord Stannis." He did not. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice like a blade. "I will expose you. I will burn your house to the ground." Cersei laughed softly. "You will try." The doors burst open. Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Jaime Lannister entered, flanking a figure clad in golden armor, Joffrey Baratheon. His boyish face was marred by a smirk as he settled himself in Robert's chair. "I am the king now," he announced. "Kneel, uncle, show your loyalty." Stannis met his gaze, unflinching. "You are no king of mine." Joffrey's smile widened. "Sir Jaime, arrest him." Jaime hesitated. Even for him, this was a bold move. "He is the king's brother." Joffrey scowled. "He is a traitor." But Stannis was already moving. A dagger slipped from his sleeve, fast as lightning, and found its way into Jaime's side. Chaos erupted. Cersei screamed as Stannis fought his way to the door. Blood stained his fingers. Jaime fell to his knees, cursing in pain. But Stannis did not wait. He ran. The Red Keep was a fortress of stone, but Stannis had planned for this moment. He had seen the Lannisters' games coming. Davos Seaworth and his men were waiting for him. At the docks, a small ship prepared. As he rushed through the corridors, the alarm bells rang. The Lannister guards swarmed the castle searching for him, but Stannis was a warrior first, a politician second. He fought like a man possessed, cutting through their ranks. Davos grabbed his arm as he reached the docks. "Come, my lord." As they set sail from King's Landing, Stannis turned back, watching the city glow in the torchlight. His brother was dead. The Lannisters had won this battle, but war was coming, and he would make them bleed. The ship rocked beneath Stannis Baratheon's feet as it cut through the Blackwater Bay, carrying him far from King's Landing. He stood at the bow, gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. Behind him, Davos Seaworth watched in silence, waiting for his lord to speak. Stannis had failed. He had failed to protect Robert, failed to claim his rightful place. And now the Lannisters sat the Iron Throne with their false king. "I should have killed them all," he muttered, voice barely above a growl. Davos finally spoke. "You still can, my lord. This war is not over. The truth is on your side." Stannis turned sharply. "Truth?" His jaw clenched. "Truth does not matter to men who only care for power. They will not listen to reason. They will not listen to honor." He exhaled, a slow and controlled breath. "But they will listen to fire and steel." The ship set course for Dragonstone, where Stannis would begin gathering his forces. If the Lannisters wanted a war, he would give them one. Far to the north, word of Robert's death spread like wildfire. A raven arrived in Winterfell, and Catelyn. Stark's hands trembled as she read the message. Eddard Stark sat beside her, his face grim. Joffrey has taken the throne. Catelyn swallowed. Robert named Stannis' hand. What will he do now? Ned's jaw tightened. He had known Stannis long enough to understand the man's nature. He will fight. He will not let the Lannisters steal what is his by right. Catelyn looked toward their children, playing in the courtyard below. And what of us? Ned met her gaze. We stay out of this. For once, the North would not march to war for the South's quarrels. Winter was coming, and their duty was to prepare for the true enemy, the one that lurked beyond the wall. But fate had a way of pulling the Starks into war, whether they willed it or not. In King's Landing, Cersei wasted no time securing her power. Stannis was gone, but his claim lingered like a shadow over her rule. She needed allies, and so she turned to the only man in Westeros who could secure her throne, Tywin Lannister. The Lord of Casterly Rock arrived in the capital within a fortnight, his golden armor gleaming under the sun. When he entered the throne room, he found Joffrey lounging upon the Iron Throne, playing with his new sword, Lion's Tooth. Tywin did not kneel. Instead, he studied his grandson with cold calculation. "You are king now," Tywin said, "and a king must act like one." Joffrey smirked. "I already do." Tywin did not smile. "Then you will listen. Stannis Baratheon is a threat. He will come for us, and he will not fight alone." Cersei stepped forward. "What do you suggest, father?" Tywin's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. "We crush him before he gathers strength, and we start by securing the loyalty of the lords who might stand against us." That night, ravens flew from the Red Keep to every major house in Westeros. Promises of gold, titles, and power filled the letters. The Lannisters would not wait for war to come to them. They would bring it to Stannis. The drums of war echoed across Westeros. Stannis Baratheon had declared himself the rightful king, and the Lannisters would not suffer a challenger. The realm stood on the brink of civil war, and every house was forced to choose a side. At Dragonstone, Stannis stood in the great hall. A map of Westeros stretched before him. Candles flickered against the stone walls, casting shadows over his hardened face. Davos Seaworth stood beside him. "The bannermen are slow to declare for you, my lord. Many still wait to see if you can win." Stannis did not flinch. "Then we will make them see." Behind him, the Red Priestess Melisandre stepped forward, her scarlet robes flowing like blood. "The Lord of Light has chosen you," she said. "Only fire can cleanse the false kings from the realm." Davos frowned. He did not trust the woman, nor the strange god she served. But Stannis did. "Prepare the fleet," Stannis commanded. "We sail for Storm's End. If the Stormlands would not come to him, he would take them by force. Tywin Lannister was never one to wait for his enemies, to make the first move. With Stannis gathering strength in the east, he sent his forces south to crush any support Stannis might gain before the war even began. House Florent, long bitter rivals of the Baratheons, bent the knee to the Lannisters in exchange for titles and gold. With their help, the Lannisters struck first, laying siege to several loyalist holdings before Stannis could react. In King's Landing, Joffrey relished in the news. "Let them come," he sneered. "We will mount Stannis' head on the gates of the Red Keep." But Tywin was not as arrogant as his grandson. He knew Stannis was a seasoned commander, and unlike Robert, he had patience. The war would not be won in a single battle. It would be a slow, grinding campaign of attrition. In Winterfell, Eddard Stark read the reports from the south with a heavy heart. War was upon the realm, but for once the north was not part of it. Robb stood beside him, his hands clenched into fists. "We should fight. The Lannisters murdered King Robert." Ned shook his head. "This is not our war." "The South betrayed us before," Robb argued. "How long before they turn on us again?" Ned exhaled. I will not send our men to die in a war that does not concern us." Robb did not look satisfied, but he said nothing more. For now the North would stay out of the fight, but war had a way of pulling even the unwilling into its grasp. Stannis's fleet arrived at Storm's End under the cover of night, his soldiers storming the gates before the Lannister allied forces could react. The siege was swift and brutal. Flaming arrows rained down from the battlements. Men screamed as they burned, their armor glowing red-hot from the heat. But Stannis was relentless. He fought at the front lines, cutting down any who stood in his path. When the sun rose over Storm's End, the Baratheon sigil flew once more. Above the castle, Stannis had won his first major victory, and the war had truly begun. Storm's End had fallen to Stannis Baratheon, and the realm trembled at the sound of his name. The false King Joffrey still sat the Iron Throne, but for the first time the Lannisters had reason to fear. From his war camp, Stannis wrote letters to every great house of Westeros. "To the lords of the realm, Robert Baratheon named me his rightful heir before his death. Joffrey is not of my brother's blood. He is a bastard born of incest, an abomination upon the throne. I call upon all true men of Westeros to stand with me against the usurpers. Justice shall be done." He signed it with the sigil of House Baratheon, the crowned stag. Ravens flew from Storm's End, carrying his words to every corner of the realm. Some lords hesitated, but others heard the truth in Stannis's message. In River Run, Edmure Tully wavered, uncertain. In the Vale, Lady Lisa Arryn burned the letter, refusing to involve herself in the war. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell read the message in silence, his expression unreadable. But it was the reach that held the greatest weight. Would the Tyrells, the second most powerful family in the realm, back Stannis? Or would they bow to the Lannisters, as Tywin had hoped? The future of the war depended on their choice. Tywin Lannister was not idle. Storm's End was lost, but the war was far from over. With ruthless efficiency, he called upon the banners of the Westerlands. 10,000 men gathered at Casterly Rock, armed and ready for battle. His plan was simple: strike before Stannis could consolidate his forces. But before he could act, another challenge arose. A raven arrived from the twins, carrying a letter from Lord Walder Frey. "Lord Stark is preparing for war." Tywin frowned. Eddard Stark refused Robert's call. He swore to stay out of this. But Walder Frey's letter told a different story. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had called his banners. Though his father still counselled caution, the North had grown restless. The Lannisters had too many enemies, and now the wolves were stirring. Tywin clenched his jaw. The war had just become more complicated. At Storm's End, Melisandre stood before a great pyre, her red robes billowing in the wind. The night was dark, but the flames burned high, casting eerie shadows over the gathered men. Stannis watched as the flames consumed the effigy of the Seven, the old gods of Westeros. "This is the path to victory," Melisandre whispered. "R'hllor has chosen you." Davos Seaworth stood beside his lord, his face grim. He did not trust this woman. He did not trust her fire, nor the things she whispered in Stannis' ear, but Stannis did. "The Lord of Light will deliver us," Stannis declared, watching the fire with cold eyes. "And those who stand against me will burn." Westeros was at war. Stannis had claimed Storm's End, but the Lannisters would not yield. The North was preparing for war, but whether they would fight for Stannis or themselves remained unclear. And the Tyrells, the greatest wild card in the game, had yet to choose a side. The storm was coming, and before it was over, the realm would drown in blood. For weeks, Stannis Baratheon waited for Highgarden's response. If the Tyrells joined him, he would command the greatest army in Westeros. But the answer came not in words, but in steel. Loras Tyrell rode into King's Landing at the head of 20,000 reachmen. At his side was Mace Tyrell, his father, and behind them marched the banners of House Tyrell, golden roses gleaming under the sun. The Lannisters had won the Tyrells to their cause. Stannis' hope of overwhelming King's Landing with sheer numbers was crushed. Davos Seaworth cursed under his breath when he heard the news. "Tywin has bought them with promises of power," he said. "With the Tyrells on their side, they outnumber us." Stannis did not react. "Then we will not win through numbers," he said. "We will win through fire and faith." Far in the north, Robb Stark had raised his banners, but not for Stannis. The young wolf had no desire to fight for the Iron Throne. He fought for vengeance, for justice, for the head of Jaime Lannister and the men who had wronged his house. His war was not for a king, but for the North itself. Eddard Stark remained behind in Winterfell, refusing to take part in the war, but Robb had grown tired of waiting. The Lannisters had too much power, too much arrogance. "We ride south," he declared to his bannermen, "and we will make them remember the price of betraying a Stark." Thus the North marched, not for Stannis, not for the Baratheons, but for their own war of vengeance. With the Tyrells at their side, the Lannisters believed they were untouchable. Joffrey sat the Iron Throne, smirking down at his courtiers, convinced that he was the unchallenged ruler of Westeros. But Stannis was coming. His fleet, battered but determined, sailed toward Blackwater Bay, carrying thousands of hardened soldiers, ready to lay siege to the capital. Melisandre had prophesied that Stannis would take the city in a night of fire and blood, and fire did come, but not as he expected. As Stannis' fleet reached Blackwater Bay, the sea began to burn. Wildfire. Tyrion Lannister, acting as Hand of the King, had set the trap perfectly. Hidden beneath the waves, great caches of wildfire erupted as soon as Stannis' fleet sailed too close. Ships exploded into green flame. Men screamed as they burned alive, their armor melting onto their flesh. Davos Seaworth was thrown into the sea as his ship was engulfed. He barely survived, dragged to shore by a handful of men. Stannis watched from the cliffs as his fleet burned, his mouth set in a grim line. "It is not over," he growled. "Not yet." He led his remaining men to the city walls, battering against them with siege weapons. But with the Tyrells reinforcing the city, his army was overwhelmed. The battle was lost. Stannis Baratheon fled to Dragonstone, but his claim was all but dead. His fleet had been destroyed, his army scattered, his allies few. Melisandre whispered that the Lord of Light still had plans for him, but even she could not deny the truth. Stannis had lost. The Lannisters had won. Joffrey remained king. Tywin ruled as Hand, and the realm fell into their grasp. But the war was not over. In the north, Robb Stark still fought. And beyond the wall, something far worse was coming, something the South had ignored for too long. Winter. The true war had yet to begin. Stannis was forced to retreat, his forces shattered, his bid for the throne had failed.